The Christmas Flower Shop Murder, a Miss Marple mystery. Welcome to Detective Notebook, a cozy corner for mystery lovers where Agatha Christie inspired stories come alive. Today I've brought you a brand new tale filled with secrets, suspense, and the classic charm of timeless detective work. Before we begin, I would love to know a little about you. Where in the world are you listening from, and how has your day been so far? Share your thoughts down in the comments. It is always a joy to see this community connect through stories. If you love these kind of mysteries, do not forget to subscribe so you never miss next mystery. Now let us step quietly into today's mystery. Chapter 1. Whispers over Fruitcake. The morning after the dreadful discovery dawned bright and deceptively cheerful over St. Mildred's. Frost still clung to the hedges, and the thin smoke from cottage chimneys curled lazily into a pale sky. In the heart of the village, the bakery door stood open, releasing the rich scent of butter and warm bread into the cold air. It was a scent that usually promised comfort, but this morning it merely flavoured the gossip. Inside, Miss Marple waited patiently in line, gloved hands folded neatly around her purse. Around her, voices rose and fell like a flock of sparrows, darting, overlapping, never resting on one subject for long. Mrs. Finch, who rarely missed a morsel of news, leaned toward her friend with a conspiratorial air.
"They say he was found quite stiff, poor man, right there among the poinsettias. Imagine dying on the very eve of the fete," her friend gasped, more from delight than horror. Behind the counter, young Tom the baker tried to appear disinterested, but his ears were clearly pricked.
"Constable says there was no sign of a break-in," he offered, dusting flour from his hands.
"And if there's no break-in, then maybe the killer was someone he knew." The statement rippled through the queue like a dropped pebble in still water. Miss Marple,
ever courteous, nodded to Mrs. Finch when their eyes met.
"Such a tragedy," she murmured softly.
Mr. Fennel had seemed so content of late. The older woman sighed, delighted to have a listener. Content perhaps, but not everyone was. "I heard he quarrelled with the vicar about the Christmas roses, and Annie, his little apprentice. Well, she's been in tears since dawn." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. Across the square, the flower shop remained shuttered, a small wreath of white lilies propped against the door. Snow glittered on its step.
"Poor child."
"Such things are hardest on the young," Mrs. Finch nodded, lowering her voice. "Still, there's more to it. Some say Mr. Fennel was engaged once to a lady who left him suddenly.
Others say she came back last week." She leaned closer.
"And Annie saw them quarrel just before the fete. That's what she told Mrs. Harper, at least." The remark lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a faint bell tone. A quarrel before the fete. Such phrases, she had long learned, were rarely unimportant. Behind them, the heavy door opened with a jingle, and in stepped Mr. Carter, the vicar himself. His presence quieted the room at once. He nodded gravely to the villagers and ordered his customary currant bun. "A dreadful business," he said, when Mrs. Finch addressed him. "We must pray for his soul and for wisdom that justice be done." He turned to Miss Marple with polite warmth. "You're visiting Mrs. Weatherby this Christmas, I hear. I hope this tragedy hasn't dampened your spirits." "Not at all," she replied, her eyes twinkling, "though it does seem a most curious affair."
"I never knew flower shops to produce so much excitement." A few polite chuckles broke the tension.
The queue moved forward. Paper bags were exchanged for coins. Yet beneath the hum of chatter, Miss Marple sensed unease. Rumour had wrapped itself around the tragedy like ivy, clinging to every detail until truth and imagination were indistinguishable. But there were patterns in gossip, little repetitions, coincidences of phrase, that spoke volumes to those who listened carefully. When at last she left the bakery, the morning sun glinted off the snow, turning the square into a scene of postcard beauty. Villagers clustered near the lamp-post, whispering anew. Miss Marple paused to tuck a sprig of holly more securely into her hat, and smiled faintly. Somewhere within all this chatter lay the seed of truth. And like every good gardener, she knew how to coax such seeds into bloom. The morning had softened into a fragile winter brightness by the time Miss Marple made her way across the square. Snow crunched lightly beneath her boots, and the air carried the mingled scents of pine and chimney smoke. The flower shop, once the most cheerful corner of St. Mildred's, now stood cordoned off with a length of pale rope and a polite sign from the constable, closed for investigation. The painted words looked oddly domestic against the frosted glass.
As if even crime must mind its in a village. Miss Marple hesitated by the door,
gazing at the delicate wreaths hung behind the window, half wilted now, their ribbons dulled by the cold. Inside she could see the constable himself, Sergeant Dilly, a kindly man who had once helped her retrieve a lost hat-box. He looked up and, recognizing her, stepped outside, brushing snow from his sleeves. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his tone both respectful and weary. "Best stay clear for now."
"A sad business, this one." "Oh, indeed, Sergeant," she replied.
"I wouldn't dream of interfering. I was merely wondering whether the church might still receive its Christmas lilies. Mrs. Weatherby is quite anxious about the altar arrangements." The sergeant's expression softened. "Lilies, eh? I don't see the harm in letting you have a quick look, so long as you mind your step. Just don't touch anything." She inclined her head gratefully and stepped inside. The air struck her first, cold, yet faintly metallic, as though some invisible thread of tension still lingered. The familiar sweetness of flowers was there too, but subdued, like a melody gone out of tune. Petals were scattered across the floor, crushed beneath hurried boots.
A few stems lay bent and broken, their bright colours stark against the pale tile.
It was the kind of quiet disarray that spoke of both violence and haste. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes taking in everything: the half-drawn curtains, the toppled stool by the counter, the overturned vase that had spilled its contents in a crimson puddle. The tulips had fallen like soldiers in disarray, except for one. Amid the tangle of broken stems, a single red tulip stood upright in its vase, its petals flawless, its stem unbent. It seemed almost deliberate, like a signature left behind. "Strange," she murmured softly, "eh?" Sergeant Dilly looked up from his notebook. "Oh, nothing, my dear. Only that Mr. Fennel always prided himself on order."
Even the smallest thing out of place would bother him dreadfully. Her voice was gentle, but her gaze lingered on that solitary bloom. The sergeant sighed.
"We're thinking he might have slipped during a scuffle. No footprints outside but his own, door bolted from the inside."
"Could have been an accident, perhaps," she said.
"And yet so much of life depends on little details, don't you think?"
"A single petal, a single misstep."
He gave her a half-smile, accustomed to her peculiar way of thinking. "If only details talked, Miss Marple, you'd have the whole thing wrapped up by tea-time." She chuckled lightly, glancing toward the counter. A small brass bell still hung by the till, and behind it a list of orders was pinned to the wall. Some were neatly crossed out, others left open-ended. The last name caught her eye: church delivery pending. In the margin, faint pencil lines spelled another word, perhaps erased, perhaps never finished. "Well," she said at last, drawing her shawl closer, "I do hope you'll find the truth soon. The village depends so on its flowers, especially at Christmas." As she stepped back into the cold, the door creaked softly behind her. Across the square the snow had begun again, thin flakes swirling through the light. Miss Marple paused, glancing once more through the frosted glass at that upright tulip, a lonely splash of red amid the ruin. In her long experience, she thought, such tidiness was rarely an accident. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Past. By afternoon, the winter sun had slipped behind a veil of thin cloud, bathing St. Mildred's in a quiet, silvery light. Miss Marple, well wrapped in her shawl, made her way toward the post office, where small knots of villagers had already gathered to exchange condolences and conjecture in equal measure. News, she reflected, moved through the village far faster than any motor car. By now, every teapot within a mile likely knew the story of poor Mr. Fennel. At the post office steps, Mrs. Finch stood once more at the heart of things, her voice carrying easily across the cobbles. Charming as ever he was, she declared, but you never knew what lay behind that smile. Came here all of a sudden, no family, no background anyone could vouch for. Said he'd inherited a bit from an aunt in Yorkshire, though nobody ever saw a letter or solicitor. Her audience, 3 women in sensible coats, nodded gravely, enjoying the whiff of scandal as much as the cold air. Miss Marple greeted them pleasantly, accepted their sympathy for the shock, and moved on. She had long ago discovered that people spoke more freely when they thought her attention elsewhere. Inside, the postmistress, Miss Riggs, looked up from her counter. Terrible goings-on, Miss Marple. Mr. Fennel was in only last week posting a parcel. Odd thing that. He was nervous, kept glancing at the door.
And then he asked about train times to London, said he might visit after Christmas. Indeed?
Miss Marple smiled as though mildly curious. And did he mention whom he meant to visit? Not a word.
Only that he hoped to see old acquaintances. Miss Riggs pursed her lips.
Still he was polite enough. Paid with crisp notes, mind you, not small change.
I did wonder where they came from. Outside again, the air smelled faintly of coal and snow.
The constable was approaching along the lane, his notebook tucked beneath one arm. Miss Marple met him halfway. "Afternoon, Sergeant Dilly," she said. "You look thoughtful." He gave a slow nod. "Just spoke with the supplier from Market Barton. Seems Fennel owed him a tidy sum for the Christmas stock. They argued on Thursday right in front of the carrier's lad. Promised payment by Saturday, and then, well, here we are. Money troubles seldom keep good company," Miss Marple observed gently. Still, he appeared quite prosperous. "That's the puzzle," Dilly agreed. "New coat, fancy watch, all that. No bank account we can trace. And there's talk he met someone outside the shop Friday evening, around dusk. The butcher's boy saw a figure in a grey coat standing near the door. Couldn't tell if it was man or woman." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Grey coat, you say?"
And the hour just before the snow began? Aye, boy says they spoke sharply, though he couldn't catch words.
When he passed again, the stranger was gone. Next night, well, you know the rest. She walked beside him for a moment, her boots making faint prints in the slush.
And no letters found? No note or message among his things?
Nothing but a few receipts, and that church order list you noticed. No relatives have come forward. He might have been using another name for all we know." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Her mind turned over the image of the flower shop, the orderly chaos, the single upright tulip, and now this new thread, a grey-coated visitor, perhaps from a past life. "People rarely invent new lives without leaving some old one behind," she murmured. The constable glanced at her, puzzled but respectful. "You've a knack for seeing around corners, Miss Marple. Think it's someone local?"
Not necessarily, she said.
"But secrets have a curious way of finding their way home, especially in villages where everyone minds everyone else's business." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'll remember that." As he turned down toward the station road, Miss Marple stood for a moment, watching his figure blur into the whitening dusk. Somewhere in that delicate network of gossip and half-truths, she felt sure, the stranger in the grey coat waited, quiet, patient, and closer than anyone yet imagined. By late afternoon, the cold deepened, and the first lamps began to glow behind lace curtains. Miss Marple, glad to escape the chill, made her way back to Mrs. Weatherby's snug cottage, a cheerful place of chintz and crackling firelight. The table was already set for tea, complete with a plate of currant buns and a pot wrapped in a knitted cosy shaped like a robin. The sight alone could have restored anyone's spirits. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Weatherby said, as she ushered her in, "I was beginning to think you'd been waylaid by the constable himself. Everyone seems to have something to say about poor Mr. Fennel, though none of it amounts to much." She poured the tea with the delicate precision of a hostess born to it.
"It's dreadful, of course, but I can't help feeling there's something
unpleasant beneath it all." Miss Marple settled opposite her, removing her gloves one finger at a time. "Unpleasant, yes," she agreed softly. "Not merely in the tragedy, but in the atmosphere that follows. Villages have their ways of dressing sorrow in curiosity. Yet I find it's within the smallest inconsistencies that truth tends to hide." Mrs. Weatherby nodded, stirring her cup. "You're quite right. Do you know the Fate Committee was in a dreadful muddle this week? Mr. Fennel had promised the prize arrangements, the lilies, the roses, and the holly centerpieces. Then, out of the blue, he cancelled. Said something about a shortage of stock, though his shop looked full to bursting when I passed. She frowned.
We had to order from the next village, imagine.
It caused no end of bother. Miss Marple's spoon paused mid-air. Curious indeed. Cancelling a profitable order just before Christmas does not sound like sound business. No, Mrs. Weatherby sighed, and Annie, the apprentice, was beside herself.
I saw her the day before it happened, eyes red, poor lamb.
She said something about a misunderstanding with a visitor. I didn't press. It seemed a personal matter. Her voice dropped. Then on Wednesday, I saw a lady leave the shop in tears.
A youngish woman, not local.
Well-dressed, though not fashionably so, grey coat, gloves without buttons. She turned toward the station. If memory serves, Miss Marple lifted her teacup, concealing the flicker of interest in her eyes. A woman in grey, you say? That does fit rather neatly with a certain report the constable mentioned. Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward. Do you suppose she might have been, involved with him? You know how these things can be. He was handsome, in a rather self-assured way. Some women like that sort of man. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied gently. But one must be careful with assumptions. A woman in tears might as easily weep from remorse as from heartbreak. Still, emotion often precedes folly. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking the pause that followed. The fire popped, sending up a small shower of sparks. Beyond the frosted window, the village square lay hushed, the snow reflecting the lamplight in silver pools. I wonder, Mrs. Weatherby mused at last, if it's money after all. They do say he owed several bills. Or perhaps blackmail. He did seem nervous of late. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the robin teapot, the crimson yarn bright against the white cloth. Money, she said thoughtfully, is a common enough motive, but not always the deepest. People will risk ruin for the sake of pride, or to protect a reputation they fear might crumble under scrutiny. It's remarkable what one small lie can cost when it begins to grow. Mrs. Weatherby shivered lightly. You make it sound as though we all have something to hide, Jane. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, not at all.
Only that even the most respectable among us prefer our secrets neatly tucked away, like the best china.
We bring them out only when we must. Outside, the church bells began to toll for evening service, their notes low and clear through the snow. Miss Marple reached for another bun, her manner serene. Yet, inwardly, she felt the stirrings of something sharp and certain. Somewhere beneath the village's polite chatter, beneath the hymn-sweet calm of Advent, a human frailty waited to be uncovered, a small, shameful truth wrapped in holly and good intentions. Chapter 3, Petals and Secrets. The morning after her tea with Mrs. Weatherby dawned crisp and bright, the snow on St. Mildred's Green sparkling under a pale sun. Miss Marple, wrapped in her thick wool coat, made her way toward the post office, her mind busy with the tangled threads that seemed to wind through the quiet village. She carried a parcel for her nephew Raymond, though, truth be told, curiosity was as much her errand as familial duty. As she turned the corner by the greengrocer's, a dash of red caught her eye. A young woman stood before the post office window, fumbling with a small envelope. The colour of her scarf, bright, almost defiant, seemed out of place against the hush of white snow and the muted browns of the shop fronts. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she pressed the stamp down, glancing over her shoulder more than once. Miss Marple slowed her pace, the picture before her stirring an old instinct. Anxiety, guilt, and haste, three emotions that rarely travelled without reason. The young woman dropped the letter into the post-box, exhaled sharply as if from effort, and turned to leave. At that precise moment her gaze met Miss Marple's. For the briefest instant there was recognition, followed swiftly by alarm. "Good morning," Miss Marple said kindly, stepping aside to give her room on the narrow pavement. The woman hesitated. "Oh, yes, good morning," she replied, her voice taut, her eyes darting toward the road.
Cold, isn't it?
She gave a weak laugh that dissolved into silence. "Indeed it is," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "A fine day for letters, though. There's something comforting about a written word. It carries both memory and conscience, don't you think?" The young woman blinked, uncertain how to respond.
I really must be going," she murmured.
She turned quickly and disappeared down the lane, boots crunching on the frost. Her red scarf fluttered once in the breeze before vanishing behind the baker's awning. Miss Marple stood for a moment, thoughtful. The postmark on that letter, she suspected, might prove more revealing than any gossip at the bakery. Later that afternoon, she stopped by the constable's office, ostensibly to deliver some church announcements. Constable Reeves, a good-natured man of limited imagination, was sorting reports when she arrived. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully, "you'll be wanting to know about yesterday's visitor, I'll wager. The lady in the red scarf, wasn't it?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "So she's known to you?" "Miss Clara Dunn," Reeves said, leafing through a folder. "Used to work for Mr. Fennell when he first opened shop.
Handy with arrangements by all accounts.
But she left last month, rather suddenly too. Something about personal difficulties." He gave her a reference all the same. "We thought no more of it. How interesting," Miss Marple murmured.
"And she's still in the village?"
"Staying with her aunt on Church Row. Seemed a quiet sort when she worked there, though lately folks say she's been keeping to herself."
"Oh, and between you and me, she was seen arguing with Fennell in the market not long before he died. Likely nothing, but still."
Miss Marple's expression was mild, but her mind sharpened at once. "I see. Arguments often seem small to the onlooker, yet to those involved they are never so trivial." Reeves chuckled. "You've a way of making everything sound serious, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "Only because human nature tends to be so, even when wrapped in a pretty ribbon." As she stepped back out into the fading afternoon light, Miss Marple glanced once more toward the red pillar box. The snow had begun again, soft flakes settling on its rounded top like sugar on a cake. Somewhere, that letter was on its way to a person whose name, if known, might unlock the next door in this quiet little labyrinth. And Miss Marple, walking home through the hush of falling snow, could not help but wonder what words, written in haste and sealed in fear,
had Miss Clara Dunn just sent out into the world.
The parish hall smelled faintly of polish and cinnamon biscuits. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust motes swirling like snowflakes as the village fete committee gathered around the long oak table. The mood, however, was anything but festive. Though they tried for smiles and polite conversation, unease lingered like an unwelcome draught. Miss Marple, seated discreetly at the end of the table with her knitting, observed in silence. She had been invited, as usual, to advise on the floral arrangements, but her sharp eyes were fixed less on chrysanthemums and more on faces. Mrs. Finch, bustling as chairwoman, clapped her hands briskly. "Now, my dears, let's begin. We mustn't let poor Mr. Fennell's, unfortunate passing put a dampener on Christmas. The fete will go on as he himself would have wished." Her tone was bright, but her eyes darted to the others as though seeking confirmation. Mr. Carter, the vicar, nodded gravely. "Indeed, life and charity must proceed. The church still requires its new altar cloth, and the children their carol candles." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Yet when Mr. Carter mentioned Mr. Fennell by name, Mrs. Finch's hands stilled on her papers. She glanced quickly toward the treasurer. Mr. Barnes, a thin man with spectacles perched halfway down his nose, who immediately began tapping his pen against his ledger. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Small detail, but then small details were her métier. "Now, about the rose competition," Mrs. Finch said hastily. "Mr. Fennell was to have provided the arrangements for the judging tent. We shall, of course, need a replacement." Mr. Barnes cleared his throat. "That may be difficult," he said. "The deposit for the flowers was already paid, but the remaining funds, well, there's been some confusion in the accounts." "Confusion?" Mrs. Weatherby asked sharply. "Surely not. Mr. Fennell was most particular about his invoices." Mr. Barnes adjusted his glasses. "I'm simply saying some amounts don't quite balance. Likely a clerical oversight." Miss Marple watched him with mild interest. The man's nervous tapping had increased, his gaze fixed firmly on his ledger rather than the others. Mrs. Finch frowned. Well, it must be sorted before the fete. The church can't afford delays. I'm sure Mr. Fennell kept excellent records that might now be in police.
Hands, murmured Mr. Carter.
Words hung in the air like frost. There was an awkward pause before. Mrs. Weatherby tried to smooth it over. Perhaps the young woman, Miss Dunn, was it? Might know something. She was always helping in the shop. She's in no state to be questioned, Mrs. Finch replied tightly. Poor thing's been through enough. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting resuming. Sympathy, yes, but perhaps also protection. The conversation shifted to decorations and ticket sales, yet the undercurrent of tension remained. Mrs. Finch spoke too quickly, Mr. Barnes too little. Each remark about budgets and deliveries was hedged with an odd defensiveness, as if everyone feared revealing too much. Finally, when the meeting neared its end, Mrs. Weatherby sighed.
It's strange, isn't it?
He was always so generous with the fete donations. Promised he'd outdo himself this year. Mr. Carter nodded. Yes. I recall him saying something curious last week at the vicarage, or this Christmas, he said.
I'll give St. Mildred's more than flowers. Miss Marple's needles stilled again.
A single loop of yarn caught mid-stitch. More than flowers. A phrase so casually spoken, yet heavy with suggestion. As the committee rose, chairs scraping against the polished floor, Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer. Through the window she could see the distant steeple dusted in snow, bells silent for now. The chatter of the others faded into background noise as her mind turned over the phrase like a puzzle piece. He promised more than flowers this Christmas. Whatever Mr. Fennell had meant by it, Miss Marple suspected it was not charity alone that had been blooming in his shop. Chapter 4. Footprints in the Snow. By mid-morning the thaw had begun. Icicles dripped from the eaves of the flower shop, each drop catching the pale sunlight like glass beads. The constable, boots muddied and brow furrowed, stood at the narrow alley behind the building. Miss Marple arrived just as he bent to examine the softening snow. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, straightening and gesturing with his notebook. "Thought you might take an interest. Found something odd here. Footprints, but they don't make much sense." Miss Marple, leaning lightly on her walking stick, peered down. The snow was patchy now, the once solid blanket breaking into islands of slush and frost. But there they were, faint impressions just discernible. Small, neat prints leading from the back door, curving toward the lane. "They're quite delicate," she murmured, crouching slightly. "Not a man's boot, I think." "No, ma'am." "Too light." "And they stop halfway." He pointed to a place where the trail abruptly vanished in melted ground. No sign of turning back, no sign of running off, just gone. Miss Marple studied the pattern, her gaze calm and calculating. The prints had depth in places and almost none in others, a rhythm that told a story, if one knew how to listen. "You see here?" she said softly, touching her stick to one print. "The heel sinks deeper on this side."
"And again here."
Whoever walked this way carried something heavy enough to shift their balance. Reeves squinted.
"You mean they weren't escaping?" "Perhaps not," she replied.
"It's possible they were arriving or returning." The constable frowned, chewing on the end of his pencil. "Returning?"
After the murder?"
Miss Marple's tone was mild. People do the most curious things when conscience or fear presses upon them. Some come back to fetch what they left behind.
"Others to be sure of what they've done." Reeves made a sound between a sigh.
"And the prints being so small. Could be a woman, you think?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She lifted her eyes to the narrow back door of the shop. The keyhole glinted faintly in the weak sun. "I think," she said at last, "that whoever made them knew precisely where to tread. See how the steps avoid the deeper snowbanks? A person familiar with this place would move so." The constable jotted something down.
"Could be Miss Dunn, then."
"She worked here long enough to know her way around." "Could be," Miss Marple echoed gently. "And yet I wonder. The distance between steps, too deliberate for panic, too measured for guilt. No, this feels like certainty, not fear." Reeves frowned again, looking uncertain. You make it sound almost planned. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A good many things are, Constable. The difference between an accident and an arrangement is usually intention. She bent once more, examining the faint outline of the last visible print before it vanished into melted earth. The edges were clean despite the thaw, a sign the impression had been made late after the worst of the night's cold. Fresh enough, she murmured, half to herself. Someone was here not long after sunrise. Reeves whistled low. Then we've got more visitors to account for. Indeed, said Miss Marple, straightening. And if I may suggest, Constable, you might ask at the bakers who passed by this way early this morning. Bakers always notice footprints. They sweep them up. He grinned at that, tipping his cap. You've a way of seeing sense in slush, Miss Marple, she chuckled softly. Only because I've seen many a tidy soul trip over what they thought was solid ground. As they turned back toward the lane, the faint sunlight gleamed on the melting snow, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered once more on that final, solitary heel print, pressed firm and certain, like the echo of a secret returning home. The afternoon light slanted through the cottage window, pale and gentle, as Miss Marple made her way up the cobbled path to Annie Harper's door. The young apprentice had been staying with her mother since the tragedy, her small room above the flower shop now sealed off with police tape. The scent of wood smoke and something sweet, perhaps stewed apples, drifted from inside. When Miss Marple knocked, it was answered almost at once.
"Miss Marple," Annie exclaimed, eyes red-rimmed but brightening at the familiar face. "Oh, please do come in."
"Mum's gone to fetch milk, but I've just put the kettle on." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly, stepping into the neat little sitting room.
"I thought you might enjoy a bit of company."
It's never easy when one's place of work becomes a subject of such unpleasant talk. Annie nodded quickly, fussing with the cups. "It's dreadful, miss."
"Everyone's whispering about Mr. Fennel saying all sorts of things."
"But he wasn't a bad man, truly. A bit secretive, perhaps, but kind enough." Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression one of patient interest. "Secretive, you say?" Annie hesitated, glancing toward the window as if to be sure no one stood outside. "He'd sometimes lock the back room," she said softly.
"Said it was to keep something safe." "I never asked what, but it wasn't the till. He kept that up front."
"Once I went to fetch ribbons and found the door shut tight. He came out a moment later, looking flustered, like I'd caught him at something private." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And did he say what it was he was keeping safe?" Annie bit her lip. "Only once. It was last week." He smiled in that funny way of his and said, "Some gifts are better hidden until Christmas morning." I thought he meant a surprise. Something for the fete, maybe. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps he did. Though surprises, in my experience, often have more than one meaning. Annie poured the tea, her hands trembling slightly. He'd been different these last few days.
"Nervous, I think. I heard him arguing with someone, though I didn't mean to listen." "Arguing?"
Miss Marple's tone remained light, but her eyes sharpened. "With whom?" "I don't know," Annie said, lowering her voice. "It was after closing, and I'd left my gloves inside. When I went back to fetch them, I heard voices through the back door, his and a woman's. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. Hers was soft, pleading, like she was asking him not to do something. Did you recognize the voice?" Annie shook her head.
"No, but she sounded frightened."
"Or maybe ashamed."
"I couldn't tell." Miss Marple let the silence stretch, the faint ticking of the clock filling the room.
"And that was the same night?"
Annie nodded. "Yes, miss."
"The night it happened. I left as soon as I heard the latch turn. I didn't want to be caught listening." Miss Marple sipped her tea, thoughtful. "Quite sensible of you, my dear. And yet you've told me something very important. People seldom plead unless the matter is personal, and personal matters have a way of hiding under the prettiest ribbons." Annie looked worried. "Do you think she, whoever it was, might have hurt him?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that when someone says a gift must be kept hidden, it's worth asking who it was meant for." The kettle whistled softly on the stove, and for a moment neither spoke. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, flakes swirling past the window pane like drifting petals. Annie stared into her cup, her voice a whisper. He was going to surprise someone for Christmas.
"I just know it." Miss Marple smiled kindly, though her eyes were far away.
"Perhaps he was, my dear. The question is, was it a gift of affection or one of revelation? The old clock ticked on, steady as breath, as Miss Marple's thoughts turned toward the locked back room and the secrets that might still be waiting there, wrapped not in paper, but in silence. Chapter 5. The Ledger of Lies. The flower shop was quieter now, its bright window displays gone dull beneath the grey light of afternoon. Miss Marple stood just inside the doorway as Constable Reeves unlocked the back room with a clumsy hand. The faint scent of wilted roses lingered in the air, mingling with something sharper. Dust and memory, perhaps? "You've 5 minutes, Miss Marple," Reeves said, holding the door open. "Inspector's due later, and I've no wish to explain why you're poking about." "Of course, Constable," she replied sweetly. "I'll be quick as a whisper." The small back room was chilly and dim, lined with shelves of vases, ribbons, and empty seed tins. A crate of holly sprigs sat overturned in one corner, leaves scattered like broken confetti. Miss Marple moved with quiet deliberation, eyes scanning for what might seem out of place. She had learned long ago that people rarely hid things far from their daily reach, just far enough to pretend they weren't there. Behind a wooden crate marked "Winter Stock," her gloved fingers brushed against a corner of paper. She knelt, easing it out, an old ledger, its spine cracked and edges smudged with dirt. The first few pages were ordinary enough, lists of blooms, deliveries, and payments. But deeper in, the tone changed. Amounts were scribbled over, certain names underlined twice. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on one entry, dated 3 weeks before Mr. Fennel's death. CD, payment received. Final installment, CD. She knew the initials now. Clara Dunn. She turned another page, and an envelope slipped free, resting lightly against her wrist. The handwriting was firm but unsteady, as though written in haste. It was addressed simply, "To CD, for when truth can no longer bloom." Miss Marple hesitated. Such things were meant for private eyes, but in matters of life and death, discretion and duty often danced uneasily together. She unfolded the letter carefully. "My dear C, there are debts that cannot be settled in money, though I have tried. You fear discovery. I cannot blame you, but I can no longer live with the weight of your silence and my own deceit. You will have your forgiveness, though not as you expect. Some gifts must be paid for in full, and mine shall be offered soon. When you see the holly bloom, think kindly of me. Forgiveness through sacrifice, that is all that remains. Yours, H.F. Miss Marple read it twice, the meaning settling like falling snow. Not anger, remorse. Not a threat, but confession. Behind her, Constable Reeves cleared his throat. "Find anything of use, Miss Marple?" She folded the paper gently and slipped it back into its envelope.
Perhaps, she said softly.
"Though not in the way you mean. Tell me, Constable, did the inspector say whether Mr. Fennel's cause of death was confirmed?" "Not yet. Poisoning's been mentioned, but they're waiting on the lab." "Why?" "Oh, no reason in particular," she replied mildly. "Only that sometimes people who mean to die take care to make it seem otherwise." Reeves looked startled. "You think he did himself in?"
"I think," Miss Marple said, brushing dust from her gloves, "that guilt has a curious scent, heavier than lilies, more lasting than roses."
"And Mr. Fennel, it seems, had much to atone for." The constable frowned, unconvinced, but thoughtful. "Still, there's that letter to Miss Dunn. Sounds like trouble between them?" "Indeed," she murmured. "But not every trouble ends in anger. Some end in peace, a kind of terrible, final peace." As she left the shop, the faint tinkle of the doorbell seemed unusually loud. Outside, the village roofs gleamed with thawing frost, and the church bells began to toll for evensong. Miss Marple paused on the step, the envelope's words echoing in her mind. Forgiveness through sacrifice, and beneath the fading petals of the flower shop, she felt certain, whatever truth lay buried here, it had not been planted in hatred, but in sorrow. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her small fire in the sitting-room at Hillside Cottage, spectacles perched on her nose and the flower shop ledger open upon her lap. Outside, snowflakes tapped faintly against the window-pane, the sound steady and soothing, though the words before her were anything but. Her knitting basket sat untouched beside her. The ledger, she had discovered, was no mere record of floral orders. Names were replaced with initials, figures neatly aligned beside cryptic notations, arrangement, delivery, balance due. But here and there Miss Marple noted patterns, regular sums, increasing payments, the occasional underlined word, and one set of initials appeared more often than the rest, M.C. She tapped her chin thoughtfully. Reverend Michael Carter. The Vicar of St. Mildred's. The first entry was 6 months old, paired with the word orchids. The next 2 weeks later, roses. The last, dated only days before the murder, read, final arrangement, settled in full. Each amount grew slightly higher, as if payment for something escalating, something secret. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the firelight flickering across the page. Orchids and roses, rare flowers, yes, but never so costly. Not unless they concealed something far more valuable than petals. She closed the ledger, slipped it into her reticule, and reached for her shawl. The vicarage was only a short walk away, its windows glowing softly against the twilight. When Miss Marple arrived, the scent of wood smoke and wax polish greeted her. Reverend Carter answered the door himself, his usually placid expression tightening ever so slightly when he saw her. Miss Marple.
"Out on a night like this?"
he exclaimed. "Do come in." "Thank you, Reverend," she said with her usual gentleness, stepping inside. "I've just come from the flower shop. There's something I thought you might help me understand." He motioned toward the hearth, where a low fire crackled.
"Terrible business, that poor man's death," he murmured. "I trust the constable is making progress?"
"Of a sort," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair, "though I fear progress in such matters is less about evidence and more about understanding character." The vicar smiled faintly.
"Ah, yes."
"You have a gift for that, Miss Marple." She inclined her head modestly. "I do try." Speaking of character, Mr. Fennel kept excellent records. His ledger was quite revealing. He seems to have had rather generous dealings with someone bearing your initials. For a moment, the only sound was the fire's soft hiss. Then the vicar's teacup rattled as he set it down too quickly.
Yes, well, of course he supplied the church regularly."
"Flowers for the altar, funerals, weddings, these things add up." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "And yet the sums seemed unusually high for mere blossoms, unless of course they were payments for silence rather than stems." Mr. Carter's hand went to his collar. "Miss Marple, you make it sound as though I—" "Oh, I make nothing sound like anything," she interrupted gently. "I only observe. And I observed that your church donation box was short by quite an exact amount last month, the same figure appearing here." She tapped her reticule lightly.
"Curious coincidence, don't you think?"
The vicar's shoulders sagged. "It wasn't what you think," he said softly. Fennel knew of an old indiscretion, something from before my time here. He never said it outright, but he let me know. That he knew, and so you paid," Miss Marple murmured, "not for forgiveness, but for silence." The fire popped, scattering a brief rain of sparks. He looked up, eyes weary.
"I meant to make it right, truly. He promised it would end with Christmas, that he'd destroy the record." Miss Marple's gaze was kind but steady.
"It seems, Reverend, that he did intend an ending, just not the one you expected." He bowed his head.
"Dear God, I never wished him harm." "I believe you," she said quietly, rising to go.
"But remember, guilt is a strange gardener. Left untended, it grows roots in the most respectable soil." Outside, the snow had ceased, leaving the world hushed and clean. Miss Marple walked home beneath the church bell's faint chime, the ledger's weight in her bag, a reminder that virtue and weakness often bloomed side by side, indistinguishable, until one wilted first. Chapter 6. Candles and Confessions. The evening bells of St. Mildred's tolled softly, their notes drifting through the frost-laced air as villagers filed into the pews. The nave glowed with candlelight. Brass gleamed and pine garlands twined the altar rails. Yet beneath the hush of carols and rustle of coats, Miss Marple sensed a tremor, an undercurrent of guilt that rippled like a chill through the congregation. The vicar's sermon, usually measured and comforting, faltered tonight.
Words caught.
Pauses lengthened. His eyes lingered too long on the lilies beside the pulpit, the last arrangement Mr. Fennel had delivered. When the final hymn ended, his hands trembled as he folded them in prayer. As the villagers drifted out into the cold, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze gentle but steady. She waited until only the faint scent of wax and pine remained. At last, Reverend Carter approached, his expression a portrait of fatigue. "You stayed behind, Miss Marple?" "Yes," she said softly. "I rather thought you might wish for company." He gave a wan smile. "You see too much, I fear. Only what others would rather overlook." She folded her gloves neatly on her lap.
"You seemed—"
"Troubled this evening?" The vicar sank into the pew before her, shoulders bowed beneath his cassock. "I suppose there's little use pretending."
"I've been a coward, Miss Marple."
"Fennel's death has forced my conscience into the light." Her tone was mild, almost motherly. "Then perhaps it's best to let it breathe." He drew a long, uneven breath. "I lent him money, you see, church funds, technically. He was desperate to make the Christmas fete magnificent this year. Said it would restore the village's spirit after so much hardship."
I wanted to believe him.
But the sums grew larger and his promises vaguer. When the accounts failed to balance, I panicked. If anyone discovered the shortage, my reputation, my calling would be finished. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So you asked for the money's return?" "Yes." He promised to settle it before the fete.
"And then he was dead." His voice caught. "I swear I had nothing to do with it." "I believe you," she said quietly.
"But something else weighs on your mind." He hesitated. "That night I heard voices in his shop. I'd gone to speak with him privately to beg for more time. The front door was locked, so I went round to the alley. The light was still burning in the back. I heard raised tones, an argument."
"I was about to call out when the door slammed and the voices stopped." "Two voices, you said?"
she prompted. He nodded. One was certainly a woman's, young, emotional. The other— He frowned, shaking his head. "It wasn't Fennel."
I knew his timbre well.
This voice was lower, more deliberate, controlled. It sent a chill through me. And then came the scream.
Yes, a terrible sound. I ran for the constable, but by the time we returned—
He buried his face in his hands. "You know the rest." Miss Marple was silent for a long moment, watching the flicker of the sanctuary lamp reflect in the polished brass. "You did the right thing in coming forward," she said at last. "Even partial truths are steps toward the whole." He looked up, guilt and gratitude mingling in his tired eyes. "Do you think this will help the investigation?"
"Oh, indeed," she replied, rising with quiet grace.
"A puzzle is never solved by the pieces one expects, but by the ones that don't quite fit." She drew her shawl closer around her shoulders and made her way to the door. Outside, snow had begun again, fine, steady flakes softening the world into silence. Miss Marple paused beneath the porch lantern, her breath a pale cloud in the cold air. A woman's voice. Not Fennel's companion then, but whose? The hymn still echoed faintly behind her as she stepped into the night, mind already sorting through every name, every glance, every hidden tremor in the tidy little village of St. Mary Mead. That night, Miss Marple sat alone with a candle on her writing table, its flame a small, steady pool of gold amid the dark. Outside, snow fell in patient silence, blanketing St. Mildred's in stillness. She let her mind wander through the day's scenes again, slowly, as though untying a ribbon knotted by unseen hands. First came the tulip, one bloom standing straight among chaos. At first, it had seemed a mere oddity, but now she saw intention in it. In a room where petals lay scattered, one flower had been spared. That felt like thought, not chance. A sign or perhaps a farewell. Then the footprints, faint and unfinished. They began behind the shop and vanished halfway to the lane. Not a flight then, but a return. The final heel print had pressed deeper, as though the walker bore weight, or burden. Miss Marple pictured those careful steps, light and quick, belonging to someone who knew every corner of that backyard. Her thoughts turned to the door. Everyone said it had been locked from within. Yet when she'd last stood there, she had noticed a fallen stool near the latch. A practical stool, one used to reach a high shelf. If it had toppled during the struggle, it might easily have slid against the door, jamming it shut. The illusion of a lock, nothing more. She reached for paper and drew the simple outline of the doorway. If the stool had been placed there deliberately, then the person who left wanted others to believe no one could have gone out. That required both quick thinking and panic, the peculiar combination of someone desperate to hide the truth, but not hardened enough to plan well. Who in St. Mildred's fit that description? Who knew the flower shop's layout intimately enough to stage such a scene? Her mind alighted on one name, Clara Dunn. Clara, quiet, soft-spoken, with the uncertain manner of one who always expects reproach. She had worked for Mr. Fennel long enough to know which stool sat nearest the door, which latch stuck on damp days. She could move through the little shop like a shadow, and she had been seen that very night, her red scarf bright against the snow, posting a letter with trembling hands. Miss Marple thought of the envelope she had found addressed C.D. and of the words it contained, forgiveness through sacrifice. Such phrasing bespoke guilt, perhaps not for the act of murder, but for some failure that led toward it. Had Clara returned to the shop not to harm, but to repair? To recover something? To keep another's secret safe? The image formed gently in Miss Marple's mind, a woman slipping back through the snow, heart pounding, whispering to herself that she only needed a moment, that no one would know. She might have moved the stool in haste, meaning only to block the door briefly, not realizing what impression she left behind. Panic can make honest souls clumsy. Miss Marple sighed and leaned back, watching the candle gutter. In every human drama, she thought, guilt is rarely simple. Some are guilty of deeds, others of silence. Some conceal love under the name of shame. The village slept outside her window, roofs white beneath the stars. She thought again of the vicar's confession, the two voices he'd heard. If one was Clara's, whose was the other? Not Mr. Fennel's, the vicar had said. That single detail shifted everything. Clara might not be the killer at all, but the witness who fled, too frightened to tell the truth. She folded her notes neatly, aligning each edge with care. Tomorrow she would not accuse, she would observe. Those who hide grief often reveal it by touch, the way a hand lingers on a shop door or trembles near a flower that recalls what was lost. Miss Marple extinguished the candle. Darkness folded around her like velvet. The stool, the tulip, the vanishing prince, all pieces of a puzzle that was at last beginning to take shape. And in the quiet of her little room, she whispered to the night, "Clara Dunn, what were you trying to put right?" Chapter 7. Truth Beneath the Holly. Miss Marple's kettle sang softly in the cosy warmth of her sitting-room, steam curling like gentle ribbons as she poured tea into delicate cups. The snow had melted to a slush on the village lanes, leaving the evening damp and fragrant with earth and wood smoke. Across from her, Clara Dunn sat with hands clasped, eyes downcast, fingers twisting a handkerchief as though it might hold her courage together. "My dear," Miss Marple began gently, setting her cup on the saucer, "you must understand that one can speak freely here."
"No one will judge you harshly for telling the truth," she smiled, calm and steady, like sunlight on frost.
"The sooner everything is out, the lighter the heart becomes." Clara nodded, lips pressed together. A tremor ran through her, but she did not yet meet Miss Marple's eyes. Silence filled the room for a moment, only punctuated by the clink of spoon against porcelain as she stirred her tea absently. Clara whispered at last. Her voice was low, almost drowned by the patter of rain on the windows. "I suppose you know part of the story already."
"About the letter? About the night?"
"Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "And now it is time for the rest." Clara drew a shaky breath. "Mr. Fennel."
"He was my husband."
"Or he was once. Years ago, he left me. Under another name, yes. He disappeared, vanished into another life while I remained with our daughter alone." Her throat tightened.
"I discovered he was in St. Mildred's just a fortnight."
"I went to confront him, to understand why he had abandoned us." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging without interruption. Clara's gaze lifted, glistening with unshed tears.
I asked him
To explain, to give me some kind of apology. But he laughed, mocked me, said that I had no claim to his time, his care, or his heart.
I lost my temper. I struck him. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head. It was an accident.
He stumbled, hit his head on the counter.
I didn't intend.
Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. A moment of panic can make even the kindest soul act in ways they never imagined. Clara nodded, letting out a breath she had held too long.
I fled because I was afraid.
Afraid the law would not see the truth, that I would be branded a murderer when it was just misfortune.
I left the door as I found it, though I thought I had covered everything. She shivered. I didn't even think to check the stool. I ran into the night.
The snow hid my footsteps. And the letter? Miss Marple prompted softly. Why send it? Clara's eyes fell again. Because I could not speak to him, not in person. I wanted to explain, to say I was sorry, to leave the truth where it might be found safely. Forgiveness through sacrifice.
That was all I hoped. Miss Marple reached across, placing a steady hand on Clara's. My dear, you were driven by fear and grief, not malice.
One does not always choose the way events unfold, only the choices one makes in the moment. Clara's hands unclenched slowly, tears slipping down.
Do you think anyone will understand?
They will, Miss Marple said quietly. Though it may take time, the heart is generous when given a chance to see both sides. You acted to right a wrong, though the outcome was tragic. That is different from evil. A faint, tremulous smile broke through Clara's sorrow. I only wanted him to see reason.
Only that. And now, my dear, Miss Marple said, drawing her shawl tighter, you must let the truth follow its course.
What matters is that it is known, not hidden. Clara nodded. The weight of her secret eased just a fraction by the gentle warmth of tea, the steady patience of a friend who understood the human heart. Outside, snow had ceased entirely, leaving the village quiet and still. Inside, a different kind of hush prevailed, the hush of confession, of release, and of a story at last told. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, her thoughts already turning to how the village would heal, and how sometimes accidents bear the guise of justice in the quietest corners of life. Miss Marple stepped lightly down the lane, the slush of melting snow soft beneath her boots. In her hand, she carried Clara's confession, carefully folded, as one might carry a fragile bloom. The village lay hushed beneath the evening sky, lights glimmering from windows like stars fallen to earth. She knew what must be done, yet her heart was intent on mercy as much as justice. The constable awaited at the edge of the lane, lantern in hand. Miss Marple, he said, noting the calm certainty in her manner, you look as if you've solved it. I have, constable, she replied softly.
And now we must act, but with care.
The truth need not be cruelly handled. Her eyes glimmered with the faintest smile. Clara Dunn must be treated gently as one would tend a wounded bird. Reeves nodded solemnly. Understood, Miss Marple. We'll proceed as discreetly as possible. Together they approached the small cottage where Clara waited. When the door opened, she appeared pale but steadied, a quiet resolve in her eyes. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. All is known now, my dear. Let them see only what is necessary. The constable stepped forward. Clara, you are not in danger of harm. You simply need your presence at the inquest. That is all. His tone was firm, yet gentle, respecting the fragile courage she had mustered. Clara nodded, drawing in a shuddering breath.
I understand, she whispered.
Thank you for being kind. At the inquest, the small village hall was filled with familiar faces, the vicar, Mrs. Finch, the committee, and a scattering of neighbours. The coroner, a composed man with spectacles, reviewed the evidence, including the ledger, the letter, and the careful testimony Miss Marple had provided. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft scratching of pens and the occasional shuffle of papers. Miss Marple watched Clara sit at the witness table. Though trembling initially, she found comfort in the constable's reassuring presence and the calm dignity with which Miss Marple had prepared her. When it was her turn, she spoke simply and truthfully, recounting the events that led to Mr. Fennel's accidental death. There was no drama, no embellishment, only the gentle unveiling of facts as the coroner considered the evidence. Miss Marple's mind wandered to the tulip that had stood among scattered petals, to the stool that had blocked the door, and to the delicate footprints that had vanished halfway down the lane. Each detail had been a small thread in the tapestry of truth, now revealed. When the coroner finally spoke, his tone was clear but gentle. The death was accidental, with no malice intended. A soft sigh of relief passed through the hall. Faces relaxed, shoulders uncurled, and the tension that had weighed upon St. Mildred's lifted. Mrs. Finch dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and even the vicar exhaled deeply as though a long-held burden had been removed. Clara, still pale, allowed herself a small, grateful smile. Afterward, Miss Marple stepped outside into the quiet night. Snow had begun again, each flake drifting lazily, coating the village in a peaceful hush. She paused on the lane, watching it settle over rooftops, fences, and bare branches. There was a rhythm to the world returning, a gentle cadence that mirrored the restoration of truth. Truth, she thought, is much like a flower. Even in the coldest winter, even after missteps and sorrow, it can bloom again. The petals may be fragile, the stem bent, but the heart of it endures, offering grace to those who notice its quiet resilience. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer, letting the falling snow dust her hair. The village had suffered, learned, and in its way forgiven. And as she turned to make her way home, the soft crunch of her boots on the snowy path reminded her that life, with all its gentle mysteries, carries on even in winter. Even after shadows have passed, the light returns, and with it, the peace that follows revelation, care, and the patient unfolding of truth. Chapter 8. Snowfall and Reflection. Snow lay thick and sparkling over St. Mildred's as dawn broke on Christmas morning, turning the village into a quiet, glistening tableau. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, curling upward to mingle with the pale pink and gold of the waking sky. The square, still dusted with frost, was silent save for the soft crunch of boots on snow as early risers ventured out, careful and deliberate after the week's unsettling events. From her favourite bench beneath a lamp-post near the bakery, Miss Marple watched the first villagers stir. Mrs. Finch, ever eager despite the sombre undertones of the past days, bustled along with a basket of freshly baked mince pies, greeting passers-by with cautious smiles. Even in the aftermath of Mr. Fennel's tragedy, the habitual rhythms of kindness and routine persisted. Children, their cheeks rosy with cold, peered wide-eyed through the frosted windows of the flower shop, captivated by carefully arranged poinsettias and garlands of ivy. Miss Marple's gaze drifted over the village with gentle appreciation. Here, a newly repaired fence marked the efforts of neighbours uniting to restore the familiar. There, a path swept clean of snow bore the careful marks of someone taking pride in the ordinary, in the daily gestures that make a village feel safe. Small acts of restoration, trivial at first glance, now felt like stitches mending the delicate fabric of communal life. She noted the expressions exchanged across the square, hushed greetings, nods, and murmured reassurances. Suspicion and fear had not vanished entirely, but they softened under the warmth of shared history and the comfort of known faces. Each smile, each careful word, seemed like a petal unfurling after frost, fragile but determined. The flower shop itself was transformed, wreaths hanging over the door, a gentle bow at the handle. Its windows shimmered with condensation from the heated interior, and through them Miss Marple could see the neat rows of flowers, the bouquets arranged with care, the subtle artistry that Mr. Fennel had always admired and encouraged. The shop's revival symbolized more than commerce. It was a tangible sign of resilience, a promise that beauty could follow sorrow. As she strolled slowly through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the events that had passed. Each detail, the vanishing footprints, the tulip that had stood among fallen petals, the confessions shared over cups of tea, had left a mark not only on the hearts of those directly involved, but on the entire community. People had been tested by fear, confronted with secrets, and forced to reconcile with their own judgments. Yet through it all, small gestures of kindness, patience, and understanding had created ripples of calm. Children laughed softly now, building snowmen near the church steps, their small voices carrying a note of innocence and hope. Neighbours exchanged packages and gentle words of encouragement. Even Mrs. Weatherby, known for her sharp tongue, smiled as she passed the repaired fence at the edge of her garden. These subtle signs, Miss Marple mused, were as telling as any confession or ledger, revealing the village's pulse and resilience. She paused near the square's fountain, watching a soft mist rise as the water began to move again, freed from ice. The sun caught on the droplets, scattering light like tiny stars. In that moment, Miss Marple understood the quiet truth. A single act, whether tragic or kind, reverberated far beyond its immediate circumstances. One choice, one moment, could shape not only a life but a community, leaving footprints in hearts and paths alike. Even in a quiet village, she thought, mysteries leave traces. Not all are dangerous. Some are gentle, teaching lessons about courage, compassion, and the unexpected ways humans can affect one another. And to those who know where to look, these small mysteries reveal the enduring, tender threads that bind a community together, even after sorrow. Miss Marple smiled softly, tucking her hands into her muff. The snow continued to fall, lightly, rhythmically, as though marking a world ready to heal, ready to begin again. With each flake that touched the earth, she felt a quiet reassurance. Life persists, kindness persists, and even the smallest acts of courage or care can illuminate the darkest corners of winter. The flower shop's windows gleamed with freshly polished glass, and inside the scent of holly, pine, and winter roses mingled warmly with the lingering aroma of baked treats. Miss Marple had invited the key villagers for a gentle gathering, a moment to restore calm, to close the chapter of recent turmoil without fanfare. The vicar, Mrs. Finch, the committee members, and even young Annie found seats among the bouquets and wreaths, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, relief, and tentative cheer. Miss Marple stood near the doorway, a shawl draped over her shoulders, eyes bright yet kind. "I am grateful that you have come," she began softly. "We have shared a difficult time, and it is right that we understand what has occurred, so that our village may breathe freely once more." She paused, letting the words settle, then continued. "The death of Mr. Fennel, tragic as it was an accident. Clara Dunn acted without malice. She returned that night to retrieve her own truth, and in her panic, events unfolded faster than anyone could have foreseen." A soft murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Finch dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and the vicar bowed his head, absorbing the weight of the revelation. "It is important to see that not every sorrow comes from ill intent," Miss Marple continued. "Sometimes mistakes happen, driven by grief, fear, or a desire to make right what was wrong in the past." She walked slowly among the villagers, her gaze meeting each one in turn. "Now that we know the facts, there is room for reconciliation.
Apologies that were unspoken may be offered, misunderstandings clarified, and we may once again approach our fate with hearts lightened by truth." Mrs. Weatherby stepped forward, her voice gentle.
"I am grateful for your wisdom, Miss Marple. I had feared that we might never fully understand, but now we can restore harmony." She reached toward the vicar, who accepted her hand with a small, tentative smile. Even Mr. Barnes, usually so nervous around discussion of money and duty, relaxed, offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement to the committee members he had previously eyed with suspicion. Miss Marple lingered by a table of carefully arranged poinsettias, noting the small, restorative gestures, Annie placing a ribbon around a vase, Mrs. Finch straightening a fallen holly sprig, neighbors exchanging soft-spoken reassurances. Each movement was minor, yet together they wove a pattern of healing. Relationships that had frayed under stress began to mend quietly, as though the flowers themselves encouraged civility and patience. She allowed herself a private reflection. Human nature, she mused, was a delicate balance of error and intention, pride and humility, fear and courage. Secrets, when left unchecked, can grow heavy, yet the act of bringing them to light, gently, thoughtfully, can release a village from the weight of uncertainty. Forgiveness, Miss Marple thought, is a quiet art, practiced not in grand gestures but in patient understanding, attentive listening, and measured compassion. The villagers began to converse more freely.
Laughter spilling softly into the corners of the shop.
Plans for the fete resumed, no longer overshadowed by whispers of tragedy, but infused with a renewed sense of purpose and warmth. Miss Marple observed them, a small, contented smile crossing her features. Each person, now reassured, carried the lesson quietly in their heart, that human error need not lead to lasting harm, and that empathy often blooms where judgment falters. As she finally stepped outside, the early afternoon light caught the snow on the village rooftops, settling softly uniformly like the conclusion of a story well told. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter and took a slow breath of the crisp winter air. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest revelations arrive quietly, leaving no scars, only a gentle understanding, much like snow settling over familiar streets. In the hush of the Christmas afternoon, the village of St. Mildred seemed at peace again, its people connected by truth, forgiveness, and the comforting rhythm of life resumed.